Good Sabbath, everybody. Sorry for the delay here, also in services. Once again, the computers decide to have a mind of their own and do something, I don't know, I think they have like a little party while we're gone. And then we come back and things are kind of messed up and I got to try to put it back together again. I don't know why it happens so often. I don't know. In any case, I think we got it going, and the Facebook's page was not streaming well, at least the audio part of it, but I think that's fixed now, so hopefully all is coming across okay. And once again, I appreciate the prayer from Bill Fox. Hopefully that applies to the transmission in my Jeep, which is having some weird difficulties starting a couple weeks ago. I haven't had it looked at yet, but I'd like to hope that it'll be all right. In any case, we do have a few announcements before we have the message today. One announcement, maybe you've heard this last week, there's been a new discovery of some more Dead Sea Scrolls. Fascinating discovery of some fragments found in, oh, thank you for that. Some fragments found in the Cave of Horror. Sounds like something from a theme park. Anyway, I think this cave got the name because there were 28 skeletons found in this cave, so that kind of got the nickname Cave of Horror. But they did find fragments of some scrolls along with coins and other artifacts showing that they were deposited in this cave during the time of that the Jewish rebels fled from the Romans during the revolt of AD 132 to 136. And so the team believes, so far the analyzation of some of these scrolls lead them to believe that they may have been written during the 1st century BC. And so far I believe they contain fragments found in the books of Ezra as well as Zechariah. So that is interesting. I'm sure they'll be doing a lot of study on those fragments for some time. The other announcement is that I don't have one here, but Art had mentioned we do have some new hymnals finally printed, and new songs added to these hymnals. We'll be doing one of them today at the end of services. And we had sent quite a few of these hymnals out this past week already to people that had requested them. If you are somebody who attends with us regularly and you like to sing along, go ahead and send us an email and we can get one of those hymnals out to you. Be happy to do that. And the other announcements are regarding the upcoming holy days. So Passover is going to take place this next week on Friday evening at 8 p.m. This is Passover proper. This is the ceremony itself. And we will be meeting in this same hall that we are having services right now. 8 p.m., the ceremony will promptly begin at 8 p.m. Friday evening. Now, Sabbath services the next day will be in the same location and at the same time. And we also will be meeting here for the high days, the first day of unleavened bread as well as the last day of unleavened bread. All will be observed in this hall. Now, this building itself is adjacent to another building, and we rent this building once a week. This month we will be renting it, I think, 6 or 7 times. In any case, on the first day of unleavened bread, there will be other people using the other building, which is, there's a hallway going through downstairs into another building, so people will be using that building. And because of that, they do live video streams as well. And I came in was it last week or the week before, and we tried to do some testing to see if it would work, if we could all stream at the same time and there wouldn't be the server wouldn't be bogging down. Well, that didn't go over very well. A lot of freezing up of the frames, and it just wasn't going to work. So because of that, when we have the services for the first day of unleavened bread, the first high day, we will not be streaming live on the video. Once again, we will not be streaming live on the video for the first day of unleavened bread. We will go ahead and have the audio call. So that will be available for those people that might want to attend with us in that way. We will, I think, go ahead and still record the video service, and maybe probably shortly after services are over and after they are done doing their service, we can upload the video to our YouTube channel as well as to the Facebook page. And so it will be available for people to watch, but it just will not be streamed live at the moment. Probably an hour, maybe two later, we'll go ahead and upload the pre-recorded video of that service. As a reminder, we will also be holding Bible studies every evening in between the high days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We have been doing this for some 20 years now, having an abbreviated Bible study type of service in between the high days of Unleavened Bread. And we have traditionally gone through the first books of Exodus up to chapter 15, and we will be doing the same thing this year. And we've all covered, I think, this material many times in the past, but it seems like even though we have, there's always something else. We always find something else of great interest to discuss. And even if it's just a reminder of those things we have already learned or discussed in the past, it's always been very helpful. These studies will not be broadcast live through the video, so just to let people know they're not going to be broadcast live through the video. We will only be doing them on the conference call. Just the conference calling number. That information can be found on our website. If you have trouble locating it, I think there's two different ways to get to it, but it's pretty simple. But if you have trouble, you can email us or give us a call, and we'll pass that information along to those people who might want to join us for those Bible studies that will be at 7 p.m. every evening between the high days. It's 7 p.m. Mountain Time, obviously, so if you are attending with us in another part of the country, please adjust accordingly. Let's go ahead and go over to John chapter 1, John 1, to begin the message today. The book of John is a fascinating book. Such profound insight into Christ, into the plan of God, can be found throughout the book of John. And in fact, in the first chapter, in the first verse, the first words of this chapter, we have the earliest record of history. Of all human history, of all history of even before humanity existed, is found written in the first sentence of the book of John. And this therefore refers to a time even before the universe existed, where it says in John 1, verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And so we see that there is a reference. It is describing two beings, the Word and God, but they are of the same family, the family of God. And these two beings, we understand as we compare other scriptures, as we study the Bible and discover its profound wisdom and the history of these two beings, as much as is described in the scriptures, we see that these two beings, they had a plan, a vision. And in this vision, they saw a universe governed by an expanded family of God. And to accomplish this, they realized that the entire family would have to be tested, that they would have to be tried, and in order to ensure that the ethics, the standards of this family would never fail, considering that this family would become a family of eternal beings. And so these people would come from those who will have learned to have the highest of standards, people who could be trusted to care for other beings, to care for all of creation, for all of eternity. And this plan, therefore, called for a unique solar system to be created, our solar system, that would have a unique planet, a planet unlike any other in all of the universe as far as we know. And this planet would be teeming with life, all kinds of life that you and I see. The angels would be given charge over this planet. They would be allowed to govern, to rule, if you will, under God, of course, but they were given a measure of authority in this environment where the potential children of God would eventually exist. And in this place, the potential children of God would then have the opportunity to work out their own salvation. And so in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, we are very familiar with those words that say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that wasn't the beginning of God or his existence, but that was the beginning of the universe as we know it. And so God understood that when he created the heavens and the earth, when he gave the angels charge over this planet, that given enough time, hundreds or millions of years, we have no idea how many millions of years it took, but given enough time that some of these angels would turn. That they were given freedom of choice, and that some would turn. And so he waited, and waited, and waited for untold millions, perhaps billions of years. And eventually, we know the story, many did turn. And God said that one of the greatest of all these angels that he had created, as written in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, he calls this angel the anointed cherub who covers, that this angel was established on the holy mountain of God, talking about heaven, talking about God's government. This angel walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. This angel was perfect in all its ways from the day it was created, that is, until iniquity was found in him. It says that his heart was lifted up because of its own beauty, and his wisdom was corrupted for the sake of its own splendor, and by the abundance of its merchandising, its trading, its bargaining of evil, this angel became filled with violence and sinned, and therefore this angel was cast as a profane thing out of the mountain of God. And so the description refers to a rebellion against all that is good and righteous. And the prophet Isaiah documented God's words in Isaiah 14, that this angel said in his heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, stars referring to angels, that this angel would be wanted to be in charge of all of them. I will sit on the mountain of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Like, understanding this angel being wise enough to understand that it could never be the Most High, but it would be like, he wanted to be like the Most High, in charge of everyone, ruling over everything. But this angel was cast out. The insurrection utterly failed. This angel was exiled, but not alone. Revelation 12 describes this dragon, referring to Satan, drawing a third of the stars of heaven to the earth, again, referring to a third of the angels. And the reason they were cast out is because they failed in maintaining their commitment to living by the standards of Almighty God. So Christ, in Jude 6, speaking of this, before I go to that point, in Jude 6, the angels did not keep their proper domain, it says, but left their own abode, left their office, left their positions of authority, didn't fulfill their positions that they were given. And therefore God has reserved them in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Now Christ, he told his disciples during his ministry on the earth, Christ told his disciples that he was there, that he saw this happen with his very own eyes. He saw this happen. And he said in Luke 10 and verse 18, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He saw Satan, that was once called Lucifer, a bright morning star, cast out and fall from heaven like lightning. And if you go all the way back to Genesis 1, we pick it up there, Genesis 1. After this great battle that took place between God and the angels that sinned, the world lay in ruins, a wasteland, if you will. And God had destroyed nearly all forms of life on this planet as it lay in both physical and spiritual darkness for who knows how long. And this can only be described as what? What would happen if you took away the sun from shining on this planet? An ice age. That's what would happen. Everything, nearly everything on the planet, all life died. And Genesis 1 and verse 2 says that the earth was without form and void. And these are words that describe a wasteland, a desolation. And God would never create a world in such a state. He's not the author of confusion, but that's what had become of the planet. And darkness was on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was watching. It says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, much of which were frozen at that time. And so God was now ready to implement what would be the beginning of the final stages of his plan. It was time to create mankind. It was time to create, or I should say recreate, life on this planet in a way that would be habitable and hospitable for mankind. In Genesis 1 and verse 3, then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then later on, down in verse 8, or it's not verse 8, but let's see. God called the light day, it's verse 5. Called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and so the evening and the morning were the first day. The first day of this recreation of the planet. A lot of people think this is the creation, which it's referred to or called to, and not entirely wrong, but it really is more of a recreation of the planet, a creation of the life on this planet as you and I know it. Because the earth had become a place where both good and evil would now coexist for thousands of years. Mankind would be faced with choices, decisions to make about what to do with his life. But he was not alone in this. God did not leave mankind alone to decide everything for himself. No, God offered guidance. He offered counsel. He gave instruction about which way mankind should choose. And some of that instruction is documented in Deuteronomy 30 in verses 15 and 16, where he said, "I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, and that I command you today to love the eternal your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments." Why? So that you may live. God urges us, he urged them and urges us to choose life. He knows where it's going to lead. One way leads to death, one way leads to life. And he encourages all of us to choose his way. Why? Because it's for our own benefit. He wants us to live. That's what he desires. He doesn't desire that any should perish, but that all would come to repentance and choose the way of life. 1 Peter 1. But God knew that people would make mistakes. He knew that many would not comprehend the magnitude and the enduring consequence of choosing the way of evil. And actually, this was a part of God's plan from the beginning. We see that he understood that given enough time, some of the angels would turn. He didn't force them to turn, but he allowed for it. He gave them freedom of choice, just as he gives us freedom to choose. This was a part of the plan from the beginning. And so, because of this, God made a way for us to have salvation, to gain salvation. But it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be easy for us, and it wasn't going to be easy for him. It would cost him greatly, knowing that mankind would need a Savior. And for this reason, it was predetermined that the Word would become the Son of Man, as well as becoming the Son of God. And this unique man would be symbolized as a lamb without blemish, a lamb slain, a lamb whose blood would be used to protect people, to keep the firstborn from death. And thus the Passover was instituted long ago. Long ago. But the Word, who is Christ, symbolized by the Lamb, was destined to be slain from the foundation of the world, as it says in Revelation 13 and verse 8. This was also declared by the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 1 and verse 18, where it says, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. And then said, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world. In other words, before the world was even created, before the universe was created, God knew this was going to happen. This was going to need to happen for us. And so we see that the precious blood of Christ as a lamb, an acted oracle, played out during Passover, was not something declared at some later point as a way to patch things up when if perhaps man made a mistake, God's going to patch it up when he goes in the wrong direction. No, Passover was part of the plan from the beginning. And despite its long-standing history, even before the beginning of history, as we know it, Passover is something that has not always been observed by mankind, not all of mankind. See, the religious rite of Passover has been lost and found and lost and found and lost and found down through history. Genesis 14, back to Genesis chapter 14 this time. The description of Noah refers to him as being a preacher of righteousness. And Passover, therefore, is something that I think Noah and his family must have known about. They must have observed. I mean, being considered a person who is righteous according to God means that you keep the commandments, means that you keep the statutes, the judgments, you keep the holy days. In order to have this similar status, you and I have to do the same. And therefore, Noah and his family must have kept the holy days in some shape or form. And after the flood had destroyed all living human beings except for Noah and his family, these were passed down to his children, likely through the line of Shem. And Christ's genealogy points to the fact that it was likely a righteous line or family through Shem is where he traces his roots back to. But somehow Passover became lost again throughout history, and it wasn't observed for who knows how long until God called Abram to come out of his land, to come out of Ur of the Chaldees and to come away from where most of his relatives had lived. In Genesis 14, in verse 18, we have this description of Abram being visited by Melchizedek, king of Salem. And at this time when he had this visit, it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham, or Abram at this point, his name had not been changed yet, but he gave Melchizedek a tithe of all. Although it's not stated here, we see Melchizedek, and it's, frankly, this is an expression, it's a term that means the king of right. Who else could be called the king of right except for God, except for Christ? And also it calls him the king of Salem. Now, Salem was a location that wasn't even in existence at the time of Abraham, or it wasn't well known, at least during the time of Abram. But it means king of peace is what it means. So this must have been Christ. And though it's not stated, could it be that the bread and wine that this priest of God, this king of Salem, brought out, could it be that this was brought out during Passover? It's possible. We cannot say dogmatically, but it's possible. Now, interestingly, we see Abram gave him tithes of all. Maybe an offering was included. Maybe this was the one of the 3 times a year that people are supposed to present an offering to God. Now, we know the symbols of unleavened bread and bitter herbs and a lamb was dictated later, but the symbols that you and I now call the New Testament symbols, found in the unleavened bread and the wine, these were used by Christ, and they were instructed for us to use these same symbols. Perhaps they already existed. God already knew, because Christ slain from the foundation of the world, he already understood what was going to happen. He knew, I think, the symbols even before they were instituted. Genesis 26, Abram's name was eventually changed to Abraham, and he moved on to become known as Father of the Faithful, one of the fathers of the faithful, a patriarch from whom many generations would be blessed because of Abraham's commitment, his obedience to God. Genesis 26 and verse 4, God told him, I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give you to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Why? Because Abraham obeyed my voice. He kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And so Abraham obeyed God. He kept his charge, his commandments, his statutes, referring to appointed customs, referring to ordinances, and even my laws, it says. And this is the term Torah, referring to the first books of the Bible that contain the statutes, the judgments, the commandments of God. And so this documentation of Abraham and his obedience to God was written later, perhaps a redocumentation. And the person, the author who wrote this, understood Abraham kept these, all of these laws that you and I read throughout the first books of the Bible, the Torah, that Abraham kept them. And so it's obvious that he was considered a righteous man, and though we cannot say it with absolute certainty, it's likely that Abraham kept Passover in some shape or form. In fact, I think it's likely that Abraham, the day that he was told to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to God, as a test of Abraham, that this was likely the same day that's designated for Passover. And if you look at the symbolism involved, it's uncanny. I mean, Abraham told to offer his only beloved son, the son of promise. It wasn't his only son, but it was the one he loved. It was the one that God promised to him. And God would offer his only son on Passover, during the time of Passover. Genesis 22, if you'd go back a few chapters, 22 and verse 5. Here we have a description of this event where it says, and Abraham said to his young men, those that went with him as he went to make this offering, he told them to stay here with the donkey and the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. And so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And the two of them went up together. And so Isaac asked, where's the lamb? And Abraham replied, well, God's going to provide a lamb. Now, of all the clean animals that could be offered, why would both of them assume that we're going to be offering a lamb today? Unless It was their custom, unless they already knew, well, this is the day that we offer a lamb to God. So could it be that this was Passover, that this event took place? I think it's likely, but again, we can't say dogmatically. Exodus 12 now. Through Isaac, Jacob was born. Jacob, we know the story, he was given the name Israel. Jacob fathered 12 sons who became tribes of people that came to live in the land of Egypt. And during Israel's residence in Egypt, the 12 tribes grew to an enormous number of people. And as decades passed on, as moved into centuries, we see that Passover was lost by these people. They didn't keep God's commandments, His statutes, and His judgments. They eventually forsook God, in fact, in the land of Egypt, which is why God allowed them to go into bondage, to become slaves to the Egyptians. And there's several scriptures that indicate this. We'll talk a little bit about more about that next Sabbath. But in any case, God did not forsake Israel, though, in this place, even though they forsook Him. He saw their oppression. He heard their cries. And eventually God called and sent Moses to deliver them from Egypt, from the bondage of Egypt. And upon so doing, God, I might say, reintroduced the Passover to His people. And He did so in a dramatic way that would have profound meaning for the next several thousand years and even on into eternity, even though the meaning had, I think, stood from the very beginning. In Exodus 12, in verse 1, the Eternal spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." And it does mean month. It doesn't mean this moon, because it gives the name of the month in just a few verses here. "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight," meaning at dusk, killing it after sunset. It's the term Arab. It doesn't mean after dark, after it's completely dark. It means after the sun has set. And that's important for some of the 15thers out there to understand. "And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. And then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails." And this is symbolic. This is all portraying the fact that, the whole thing was roasted, with the exception of some of its inner parts. And it just represents the fact that Christ was totally committed, entirely committed to this cause. "You shall let none of it remain until the morning," boker, meaning the morning, at dawn. "Let none of it remain until dawn. That which remains until the morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And so you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." In other words, you shall be prepared for this event. Be ready for this event. Be ready not just for Passover, but what is going to take place afterward. I think this is symbolic for us as well, to be ready to keep Passover, but not just the ceremony itself. Be ready for what's going to take place afterward. And we'll talk more about that next Sabbath. "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Eternal. And the blood shall be a sign for you on your houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." And so this, again, symbolizes the fact that if we obey God, if we keep the commandments and strive to remain faithful to Him, then the blood of Christ can keep us from death, can cleanse us from sin, keep us safe, if you will. And so this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Eternal throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. Term meaning without end. And it goes into the description of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. And whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day shall be a holy convocation. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat. That only may be prepared by you, which is indicative of the ability to prepare food on those 2 high days. And then here we have, again, describing the month here. Verse 17, so you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this day I have brought you out by your armies out of the land of Egypt, and therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. So it's probably talking about the Passover meal that's supposed to be eaten with unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he's a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. And then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, well, pick out the lambs and do exactly as God had instructed. And it will come to pass, verse 25, it will come to pass when you come to the land which the Eternal your God gives you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And do not keep your children in the dark about it. Let them know. It shall be when your children say to you, verse 26, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it's the Passover sacrifice of the Eternal, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. And the people bowed their heads, and they worshiped God, and they went away, and they did just as the Eternal had commanded through Moses and Aaron. So they did. And so the Passover symbols are extremely profound. They are discussed throughout the Scriptures, and they are discussed throughout the books of the New Testament. Luke 22, verse 8, Christ told Peter and John to go and prepare Passover. This means that they went to prepare Passover as prescribed in the book of Exodus. That's what they did. And then on that Passover evening, he took bread. Christ took bread and gave thanks. He broke it. He gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat. This is my body, symbolizing my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And so we have Christ instituting Passover symbols that would be used from that point forward, even though some of those were used beforehand. Hebrews in chapters 9 and 10 speaks of Christ coming as a high priest offering himself without spot to God by his own blood to cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. This doesn't mean to just simply, he'll wipe away all sins. You don't have to worry about it. If you sin, don't worry about it. It's okay. He'll just wipe it away. It means he's to cleanse your conscience from dead works. So that we stop the dead works. We don't do that anymore. We do what instead? We serve the living God, it says. Romans 5 and verse 9, Paul said, much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. So this death of the firstborn is what caused the captives to be set free from Egypt. It is what allowed for those people to be set free from Egypt, and it symbolized God's firstborn fulfilling a death sentence so that we can be set free from the bondage of sin. And so that event, that Passover that they kept, and has long been kept, foreshadowed the death of Christ. It's what we are approaching this next week, because it is only his sacrifice that can atone for all the sins of humanity. Not by the blood of goats or bulls or oxen can all this sin be wiped away, but only through the blood of Christ can this sin be wiped away to free us from a death sentence. And so this ordinance, as it says, was to be kept for all future generations without end, it says, or that's what the words mean, without end. Exodus 10 and verse 2, God said to pass it down to your children, to pass it down to your children's children, to keep it going. Let's keep it going. It's not going to stop. And then in Exodus 13, if you'd look at that for a moment, in verse 3, God further instructed Israel about how these days are to be kept. Moses said to the people, remember this day which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength, by hand, the Eternal brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you're going out, and here it is, in the month of Abib, the name of the month, not the new moon of the first harvest of the green ears of barley. It's a month that had a name, Abib. And it shall be when the Eternal brings you out into the land of Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Hivites and the Jebusites that he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Eternal. Just in case you didn't get it, unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days. Not whatever day we choose, like 1 day or maybe 2 days. And some people don't like unleavened bread, and so they go, well, as long as I eat it once during the feast, that's okay. Well, it says right here, it shall be eaten 7 days. And no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Eternal did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you, a mark unto you, a symbol that you are God's people. A sign on your hand and a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. And we understand what the symbolism means. A sign on your hand, what you apply your strength to do. A memorial between the eyes, the place where we process thought here in the frontal lobes. That the Eternal's law may be in your mouth. You'll talk about it, you'll do it, you'll apply it to how you live. You shall keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. Let's go over to Numbers 9. Like the Sabbath, God's commandments and all of the annual holy days are a mark of God's people, including Passover. Now, Passover, the ceremony itself, isn't observed on a holy day. It's not considered a holy day. It is a religious rite, if you will. It is to be done the day before the high day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it begins. But it is still something that is to be done religiously. It is treated as something that is remarkable and is righteous in its own right. For clarification, technically the Passover ceremony itself is not observed on an annual holy day, even though the ordinance is holy in its own right. And like the commandments and like the seventh-day Sabbath that we keep every week, it is a mark of God's people. Passover is a mark of God's people. And so important is this issue of this observance of keeping Passover, that an issue had come up. And this had come up the year following Israel leaving the land of Egypt. And there were certain men that were unable to keep Passover because they were considered unclean because of a dead body, because of touching corpses or a dead body. Numbers 9, we'll go over a few more chapters. And we're going to read 6 verses, beginning in verse 6. that there were certain men who were defiled by a human corpse, so that they could not keep Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and Aaron that day, and those men said to him, "We became defiled by a human corpse. Why are we kept from presenting the offering of the eternal at its appointed time among the children of Israel?" And Moses said to these men, "Stand still." In other words, have patience. I'm going to go ask God and see what we should do about this. "Stand still, that I may hear what the eternal will command concerning you." And then the eternal spoke to Moses about this predicament and said, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if any one of you or your posterity is unclean because of a corpse, or is far away on a journey, he may still keep the Lord's Passover. On the 14th day of the second month, at twilight, they may keep it, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break one of its bones. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it." So in other words, everything that applied to the 14th of the first month would then apply to the 14th of the second month, if somebody found themselves in such a predicament. All the symbols remain the same. Everything remains the same. And the only allowance, of course, is if there's a legitimate reason that somebody is unable to keep it in the first month. God allows for those troubled individuals to keep it 30 days later in the second month. No other rite allows for this that is given on a certain day of the year or the week. No other rite allows for that to take place. We can't say, "Oh, I accidentally missed keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. I'll just keep it Sunday instead, make up for it." No, you can't do that. God doesn't allow for that. But he allows for it to be kept, the Passover to be kept on a different time of the year in such instances only. And so moving the religious rite to another day of the month, to the second month of the year, it should never, ever be done as a matter of convenience. We shouldn't go like, "Well, I'm planning this trip to the Bahamas, and I could plan it for another time, but I'll go ahead and do it because, I'll be out of town, and I can just keep Passover the second month." No. I mean, this is something that should be feared. This is something we should try to avoid at all costs if necessary. But if something happens, circumstances beyond our control, God allows for us to keep it other than the time originally prescribed. It says right here in verse 13, "But the man who is clean and is not on a journey and ceases to keep the Passover, that same person shall be cut off from among his people, because he did not bring the offering of the eternal at its appointed time. That man shall bear his sin." And so these facts show us here that Passover, the ceremony, was domestic. It was something that was kept in the homes or around the communities of the people. It was not a ceremony that was always performed by the priesthood on behalf of the people. Having priests kill the Passover lamb for the people is something that came later, and whether or not God approved of it, gave his stamp of approval on it, is debatable. However, Christ told his disciples to go and prepare Passover. And so he and his disciples, they prepared Passover to be kept on their own. They didn't go to the priests to have them do it for them. And I think this is suggestive anyway, not entirely, can't say it dogmatically, but I think it suggests that God was not in agreement with what had become a tradition of the people for the priests to kill the Passover lamb for everyone. 2 Chronicles 30. There is an enduring principle in these Old Testament instructions that also applies to the New. We had talked about this last week and the week before about making ourselves ready, about self-examination, of being as pure and clean as we possibly can before keeping Passover. And this is why self-examination is recommended by the Apostle Paul, and also, I think, referred to by others before the ceremony itself. And throughout the history of Noah, of Abraham, and Israel, people waxed and waned in their faith toward God. And the Passover, as I said, had become lost and found throughout history. But God's law on Passover was never elusive. God wasn't trying to hide it from anyone. It was intentionally lost. People were not faithful toward God and therefore faithful toward keeping his days. And so people lost track of, therefore, the commandments. They lost track of the holy days because of their lusts, lust of the flesh and the eyes, and because of their pride in their own lives. During the time of the judges, not all were entirely faithful during that time. Some were more faithful than others. In fact, one of the great champions of the Bible, a man known as Samson, is famous, technically infamous in some of his behaviors. And then we have a long list of kings that practiced iniquity after King David lived and died, after Solomon lived and died. There was men that came to power such as Jeroboam and Rehoboam and Nadab and Abiram and Baasha and Layla and Zimri and Omri, all wicked kings. And finally, Asa, who did what was right. And the Passover was found, was kept again. And then Jehoshaphat, Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoram, Athaliah, Jehu, Jehoaz, all wicked kings. Finally, Joash came to power, and he did what was right, but only in his youth. Eventually, he fell away. After him, there was King Amaziah, who also did right early on, but not entirely. He later turned to evil. And then there was Zechariah. There was not the prophet, but a king named Zechariah. Shallum, Menahem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and then finally King Uzziah rose up, and he was a righteous king, and the Passover was restored. He was succeeded by Jotham, who was also a good man, who enforced God's law in the land. Passover was found or kept at that time. And Ahaz arose, and after that, Passover was lost once again. Then King Hezekiah came to power, and he restored God's law in Judah. He reinstated the Passover. And 2 Chronicles chapters 29 and 30 actually are very inspiring chapters to read. I'm just going to read a few verses of chapter 30 regarding Hezekiah. In verse 1, Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the eternal God of Israel. For the king and his leaders and all the assembly in Jerusalem had agreed to keep the Passover in the second month. And it's because they were unclean in the first month. If you look at chapter 29 and verse 17, it talks about the uncleanness as this restoration was taking place. So they couldn't keep it in the first month. They understood the God's allowance for keeping in the second month. They couldn't keep it at the regular time because a sufficient number of priests had not consecrated themselves, nor had the people gathered together at Jerusalem. And the matter pleased the king and all the assembly, and they resolved to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that they should come to keep Passover to the eternal God of Israel at Jerusalem, since they had not done it for a long time in the prescribed manner. So Hezekiah came to be one of Israel's greatest kings. As far as his faithfulness to God, he reigned 29 years, and he eventually died of natural causes, and I think God gave him long life and allowed him to die naturally because of his faithfulness. However, after his death, King Manasseh rose up, and he did evil. He ruled for 55 years. Passover was lost by most once again. Amon's reign was next, and it was short, but he also did wickedly. And then Josiah came to rule, and he ruled at a young age, and his reign was a reflection of Asa and Uzziah and Hezekiah, and he did what was right for 31 years. And 2 Kings 22, you don't have to turn there, but it explains, let's go ahead and go over to 2 Kings, though. We're going to look at chapter 23, 2 Kings 23. Chapter 22 explains how Asa Josiah had repaired the temple, and he found the book of the law. He had tore down pillars and altars to false gods. He restored Passover throughout the land. 2 Kings 23 and verse 21, the king commanded all the people, saying, "Keep the Passover to the eternal your God, as it is written in the book of this covenant." And such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year, King Josiah, this Passover was held before the Eternal in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah put away those who consulted mediums and spirits, the household gods and idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might perform the words of the law which were written in the book of Hilkiah the priest, found in the house of the Eternal. And before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Eternal with all his heart and with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor after him did any arise like him. One of Israel's greatest kings. And this is some of the history of Passover, the biblical history of Passover. And this doesn't mean that this refers to everyone that kept Passover. I think there are likely others that were faithful to God that are unmentioned in the Scriptures. The Bible talks about God's church as faithful people being a little flock, relatively small, and Christ even said that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, meaning that it would never die out, that there would always be some faithful, somewhere. And so I think there were people that kept Passover that are not mentioned in the Scriptures, even when the vast majority did not, when it was lost to most. Ezra 6, because of his passion for God, Josiah was promised peace all of his days. However, after his death, Judah again fell to wickedness. The Passover was lost to them. And the Passover would be unobserved by most for some 80 years. In fact, it was not restored to the people as a nation until 70 years after their captivity in Babylon. Finally, after much difficulty in rebuilding the temple and restoring worship of God as a nation, it says in Ezra 6, verse 19, that the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, all of them had purified themselves, all of them ritually were clean, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren, the priests, and for themselves. And then the children of Israel who had returned from the captivity ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the eternal God of Israel. So Ezra had decided to centralize everything, to keep the people together, to keep them all on the same page as far as what should be done in order to maintain obedience toward God. And so he had decided that all of the priests that were ritually clean would kill the Passover lambs for the people, and because many of the people were not clean. They were returning from the filth of the nations from which they had come. And this became a tradition, therefore, from this point forward, for the priests to continue to kill the Passover animals on behalf of the people. However, the returning Jews and other mixed tribes that became known as Judah, even though there were other tribes that were involved in this return, they continued to wax and wane in their commitment toward God. And even though the Passover was kept during Christ's ministry, we see that it was widely not kept in its intent. It was not kept by the vast majority who were supposed to be clean, but they were not. Maybe they were going through the motions, but they were not spiritually clean. Christ even called the religious leaders of his time hypocrites And he said that they were blind leaders of the blind, meaning that most people were blind at that time to what they really should be doing. Not that the law was elusive to them, but they were being led astray and even blinding their own eyes to what they should be doing. Of course, this didn't mean that everybody was hypocritical or blind, but the majority was. So Christ attempted to correct that, to give the people vision regarding their obedience toward God and how they should become clean and become converted and keep Passover. And Passover was kept at its proper time and in its proper manner by faithful people for centuries since then, since Christ's ministry. However, just like in times past, people have waxed and waned in their faith toward God, and the Passover has become lost and found since the time of Christ's ministry. And thus, the Church of God has remained a relatively small flock for the last 2,000 years. And the reason was well said by Christ when he said, well, many are going to be called, few are going to be chosen. And that's because few would remain faithful. He understood that he didn't mean for it to happen, but he understood, well, he knows human nature better than we do. He understood this is going to be the case. And so the question I have for us today as we begin to close is, have we lost sight of Passover? Are we kind of going through the motions of Passover but not really understanding how we should be clean spiritually, physically, before keeping it? I had spoken last Sabbath about unworthy manners that some had and some of us might have before keeping Passover. 2 Sabbaths ago, I talked about maintaining vision, of keeping our focus, staying on track, and how many people are using situational ethics to get around keeping the commandments, of keeping God's law. And this has clouded the vision of many people, even within the Church of God. And the reason is because Christ said that many are called or few will be chosen, because many people will lose sight of what they should be doing. They'll allow themselves to become blind to what they really should be doing in this life, to remain faithful to God, to remain committed to God, in order to see beyond this world. Luke 23, Christ was most brave, honorable in all things, faithful in all things, and he suffered more than you and I likely will ever know. He overcame in this way, in his full commitment to God. And some might think, well, of course he did. You know, he was the Son of God. He had the Spirit without measure. And he understood that even though he was going to have to suffer greatly, he knew he would be reunited with the Father at some point. But guess what? You and I have the same hope. We have the same thing to consider, that we too can look beyond this life. It's not going to be easy. We know we might have to suffer a great deal. But we know eventually we'll be united with God. Eventually all things will work out well in the end, as long as we remain faithful to Him. And so I know times can be very hard for people, for all of us, whether we are facing family problems or health problems, financial struggles. There are many things that all of us struggle with, and times are getting harder, and they will become more difficult. And I know it's hard for all of us. There's much to be concerned about, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to be overly concerned with the struggles we have in this life, so that we leave off our commitment to God, that we back off from being obedient to God. We have to work in this world. We have to function. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of our families. We shouldn't let our responsibilities slide. But we also should not allow them to get in the way of seeing past this life, of seeing what is going to happen in the future, of knowing what is going to happen in the future, and knowing that we have an opportunity right now to be a part of that. We have to see past the here and now, because that is what Christ did. Now consider some of the last moments of Christ's life on this earth. understanding the enormous pain, the enormous suffering that he endured, all of the things he experienced, and notice how he responded during some of these final moments. Luke 23, verse 33. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, and this is a Latin term that is translated from cranium, meaning the skull, cranium, we may be familiar with that term. There they crucified him and the criminals on the right hand, on one right hand, and on the other on the left. Two criminals alongside him. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And yet they divided his garments and they cast lots. And the people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying, well, he saved others. Let him save himself if he's Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers, they also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, if you are a king of the Jews, save yourself. And there was an inscription also written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, saying, this is the king of the Jews. And one of the criminals who hanged beside him blasphemed him, saying, if you are Christ, save yourself and us. But the other criminal, answering, rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man, he's done nothing wrong. And then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. It was about the 6th hour at this time. There was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. And then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last breath. So the place where Jesus died was called Calvary or Golgotha, place of the skull. It was a small mountain that I think still exists in the land, in the city of Jerusalem. It had a natural geological formation that looked like a skull, looked like the impression of a skull on the side of the small mountain. It's called Calvary in the Latin, meaning cranium or cranium. This is where Christ met his end. After the beating, after the ridicule, after the mocking, after the lack of hydration, after the shame, after the lifeblood being drained out of him, Christ still maintained a vision beyond that event. A vision beyond Passover. And that is what it would mean to the teeming masses, as long as he stayed the course. So he saw past that and far into the future, and I think he likely thought of the New Jerusalem and him going to prepare offices for those who would become his bride. I bet he thought of, I wonder what my bride's going to look like and how she'll be adorned and what's going to happen when the kingdom is established and it stretches beyond eternity. This was his inspiration and his hope. And it's the same vision that you and I should keep in mind as Passover approaches. Remember all that has been done for us on our behalf by God. And be thankful. And honor the Passover that is coming, the commitment that we have made to God in this way. And strive to be unspotted from this world, as Christ was a lamb without blemish offered to God. Offer ourselves to him, striving to be without blemish, keeping ourselves from the wickedness that is just rampant in this country and in this world. And if we do, we can maintain our vision. We can see past the struggles that we face right here and right now, and we can look far into the future, beyond Calvary. And with that, I'd like to listen to a song that was composed by a Church of God member, Donna Rodenbush. I was able to work with her a bit with her in the past She's a musician who composed and had a song recorded called Beyond Calvary.